This is the second lecture for Monday, April 27th, the last day of class, the last topic, the very last lecture. And for this, we're going to talk about the future of exploitation of ocean resources, primarily fisheries, but in general, how much potential is there to exploit the ocean for different resources, especially to feed humans. So let's look at where we are and the potential for future exploitation. So in the past, the last 20 years or so, humans obviously eat a lot of food. But if you can believe this, it's hard to believe, but most of the food that's consumed by humans doesn't come from the ocean. Most of the food comes from terrestrial settings, from agriculture, from especially growing crops, but also livestock as well. It's only a small percent of the food that's consumed by humans has come from the ocean. So let's say that we, as a group of individuals, humans, as our population is able to double the amount of food that we consume from the ocean, or that the ocean provides twice as much food for people as it does now. That's not very much. I mean, a doubling is quite a bit, but it's still only providing 2% of the food that humans are consuming. As it is now, the production of food that comes from the ocean is supposedly about 350 million tons. This is all the food that comes from all the world's oceans. Now, that's not a particularly large amount when you consider how many tons of food it takes to feed over 7 billion people, regardless of how much they eat. Some people eat a lot, and some people don't eat that much. So here we are now in the late 2000s, the late 2000 teens, and the early 2020s. We're in 2020 right now, but early on, so in this new decade. And the current harvest is about 80 million tons of fish and shellfish. And so this 80 million tons, though, if you look at that in terms of all the production in the ocean, not just consumed by humans, but that's produced in the ocean, if you looked at the primary production that there was in the ocean, some from flowering plants, some from algae, a lot from phytoplankton, if you calculated how much primary production there was and how much of that is consumed by humans, basically, is this 80 million tons, about 20% of the energy that's produced in the ocean. That's a lot. And it feeds a very small percentage of the human population. So people look to the ocean as a potential source for feeding large numbers of humans. We can battle this people not getting enough to eat around the world by increasing production of food from the ocean. We can move from one species to the next. We can target some other fishery. There's all kinds of potential out there for the ocean to feed people. That's the point. But is it even realistic to double the amount of food consumed by humans that's derived from the ocean? Is it even realistic for us to think that we could possibly consume 40% of the energy that's produced in the ocean? That is a huge amount of energy consumption. So that puts it in perspective. That's in terms of going out and capturing wild animals. This rather primitive type of exploitation. That's how it is for a lot of different species. They're wild populations. We go out and catch and kill them. So there's a lot of interest in looking towards not wild populations, but cultured population. There's a lot of shrimp that are cultured around here. You know that there's a lot of oysters that are cultured. There's potential for a lot of different mariculture to feed people. So if you look at the number of species out there in terms of these wild species that are captured, look at the growth in the human population versus the growth in the fish catch, you can see how the fish catch lags behind in terms of being able to feed people. If you see the volume of commercial fish and shellfish just landed in New York, which is obviously a very big port, a lot of food comes through there, that it's peaked and started to go down since the mid-90s. And even since World War II, the fish catch had increased. There was this industrialized fleet. There was a lot of technology that went into going after fish and catching more and more fish. But even after that, it reached a peak, and it's only increased a very small amount the last 20 or 30 years or so. So if you consider the potential to increase our exploitation of ocean resources and our use of marine fish to feed the world, it's not very promising. So our ability to catch fish has gone up minimally over the last 60 years or so, 80 years, but our human population has gone up a huge amount in comparison to that. Another problem that doesn't help things is that what we do with this food has changed quite a bit. It used to be that we would catch fish and we would eat them. It was direct consumption by humans. But over the last 50 years, I was talking about this when I was talking about those fish like anchovies and herring and sardines. There's been a move towards converting, especially certain species of fish, people don't find particularly appetizing. They don't eat them that much. That they're ground up and converted into fish meal, which is then fed to pigs and chickens. And then we like eating pigs, we like eating chickens. And so the shift from 1950 to 2010 or so is that the direct consumption of fish has decreased from about 90% to only 30 or 40%. That, we eat about 60 or 70% because 30 or 40% goes towards feeding domestic animals, not towards feeding humans, but feeding domestic animals. And so with this ecological efficiency and the huge loss of energy when you move from one trophic level to the next, when you don't eat a sardine but you eat some bacon, 90% of the energy is lost. And so that is a big loss, not just in 60 or 70% compared to 90% back in the 50s, but in terms of this very big energy loss when you eat at one higher trophic level. Another problem is that there's been a shift away from eating things like sardines and anchovies and pilchards, and a shift towards eating these highest of trophic level fish, especially things like tuna and mahi. Those fish are apex predators. They're at 4 or 5 trophic levels, so they eat something that eats something that eats something that eats zooplankton, that eats phytoplankton. They're 5 levels away from phytoplankton. Now these little fish, the little bait fish, the menhaden and the pilchards and the anchovies and sardines and herring, those are about at the 3rd trophic level. They filter feed on zooplankton, which feeds on phytoplankton. It's only 3 trophic levels, quite a different. And if you take into consideration the amount of energy that's lost when you go from one trophic level to the next, and you lose about 90% of the energy, that's a huge amount of energy loss. In terms of terrestrial production, agriculture and crops and livestock, that it relies heavily on these primary producers, on corn and wheat and rice and crops like that. The marine resources, the things that we harvest from the ocean, there's not very much primary production that we utilize ourselves. We eat some seaweed, but most of the things are at higher trophic levels, especially compared to terrestrial situations. And all these different fish that we eat, most of them are carnivores. They're not herbivores. They're not consumers, primary consumers, but they're secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumers. They're high up on the trophic levels, which just exacerbates the problem of energy loss and the inefficiency of feeding on or relying on marine fish that are at these high trophic levels to feed humans. It's just it's not a situation that can be maintained. And again, if you take into consideration the amount of energy that's lost, it's a huge amount of energy that's lost each trophic level. So if you're eating sardines, now that's one thing. But if you're eating pigs or eating chickens that are fed sardines, that are feeding on zooplankton or feeding on phytoplankton, that's that much more of an energy loss. So what can we expect in the future? Well, as I said before, a lot of marine resources are fully exploited. They're overexploited. They're being fished beyond sustainable levels. We're polluting the ocean. There's pollutants in the ocean all over the place. There's gigantic problem with plastic pollution. There's a lot of problems with overexploitation of the ocean. And as opposed to this rosy picture where, we'll just turn to the ocean and we can feed the world. All these starving people around the world, we'll just have to figure out how to extract more energy from the ocean, catch more fish, catch some different species or something like that. That's probably not going to be the solution that comes about. So you guys are all young. When you're older, there's going to be some big changes probably in terms of exploitation of marine resources. There's probably going to be a lot more reliance on cultured fish, different species, invertebrates and vertebrates both. And that's probably going to be the only hope for feeding a lot of people with marine resources. Other than that, it's just the numbers don't add up in terms of being able to feed millions or billions of people with food from the ocean. Sure, there's a lot of energy in the ocean. There's a lot of food in the ocean, but it's not necessarily available to feed billions of people. We're already utilizing a large amount of energy in the ocean, especially with the type of fishing practices that we have. So it's not necessarily the rosiest future in terms of more and more production from the ocean. All right, well, that concludes this marine biology course. We've got our final exam on Monday, May 4th. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the class, even with these unusual circumstances that we had the whole time after spring break. It's quite a different type of instruction and going to college for everybody involved.